Right.
Absolutely.
So,
Great.
well, we had purposely set up this next panel to have the media presented, kind of like our Meet the Press. And I'm really excited. We have Tim Gnatek, our partner over at Blue Practice. So if you guys are on the backstage, why don't you come now onto the main stage, and we're going to close out with our final panel. And Steve, I think you and I are going to have to drop out. There you go.
Thanks, Ron.
How are you doing? Do you have all your panelists
I believe
available?
we're all coming online right now. We are TBD. It looks like we've achieved.
Great. Well, welcome aboard. Thank you guys for closing us out. We're excited. I'm going to go off and listen to what you have to say.
Thanks, Ron.
Thanks a lot,
Steve,
guys.
Too, and thanks for a great job producing this event so far. It's really nice to kind of bring it all to a close in a way, like you say. I'm not sure it's a meet the press kind of thing, but we'll roll with it right now. But it is a press thing, and the title of the session is Press Perspectives on Grid Convergence and a Clean Energy Future. And I'm just thrilled to have three amazing journalists who've been covering this space for 15 plus years each to really help go into some of those issues that we've been following over the course of the event, and maybe add in that media perspective that might either provide more context or sometimes take us down a rung or two, as journalists need to do, and be kind of a dose of realism into the conversation. So hoping to get into all of that. Again, my name is Tim Gnatek, president at Blue Practice. We're a communications agency focused on clean energy, sustainability, and climate issues. I've been doing that for 14 years, and over the course of that, I've had the pleasure to work with these three fantastic journalists, and so I'm so glad that they've had the chance to join us today. Over the course of the conversation, we do have the chat, and I know everyone has been very active in asking questions through there, and I certainly encourage that as well during this session. And we'll pick and pull through as many of those as we can, either organically through the talk, or in the final closing minutes. We'll make sure that we try to get to as many of those questions as possible. But let me just jump right in and begin to introduce our panel. I'll start with, we have two Davids and a Katie. So David Baker, or DB, is at Bloomberg and has been covering energy, utilities, climate issues for many years. I was over 15, maybe 18. Started and for a long time at the San Francisco Chronicle. But then now has moved to Bloomberg and is kind of taking a national approach to issues around grid, utilities, and energy usage. So very glad to have you, David. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, my pleasure.
And then maybe, and I'm going to seed a question with you and with David and Katie too, as I introduce each of you. But I think given that context that you have of just kind of being in the thick of it, day in, day out. Do you feel like we really are at a transformational moment when it comes to grid convergence? I mean, there's a lot of optimism, I think, that we've heard over the last few years, a lot of good reasons to be optimistic. But just from a realist perspective, is there kind of a bright outlook that we're heading towards?
I think so. I feel actually more optimistic today than I did 5 years ago. Certainly more optimistic than I did 10. And I think the reason for that is some of the companies that were not quite so enthusiastic about the transition now are actually spelling out concrete plans on how they're going to do it. And more importantly, they're actually investing the money. When you're talking about utilities, they're actually going to their state regulators and saying, okay, here are the goals that you've set out for decarbonization. Here's what we think is the timeline. These are specific investments we want to do in the next couple of years. Give us the go ahead. Mm-hmm. So it's no longer as diffuse as it was. It's no longer as future oriented as it was, as much as it is now today. Is people actually plunking down cash today? Mm-hmm. And we do still see there's lots of interesting startups again, not quite in the same sort of subfields that we saw the last time around. But yes, what really gives me hope is seeing some of the major companies involved in these spaces really beginning to invest the cash and make concrete plans to turn these ideas into reality soon.
That's excellent. Yeah, and oftentimes, money is kind of the ultimate bellwether to determine whether or not things are truly going to happen or not. Let me move on and introduce David Roberts, who's been billed as being with Vox, but David, you've actually had some pretty exciting news just early this week. You've launched your own newsletter called Volts, and you've kind of taking the indie route and being able to kind of build from all of your followers now a direct source of information on climate, energy, and policy, all three of which have been really, I think, key in your reporting, from going way back to the GrIS days to being with Vox and now starting this off. Thanks for joining us. It's really glad to have you. And I should ask too, like, if people want to follow your newsletter, is there a way for people to subscribe?
Sure. It's called Volts. It's called Volts, VOLTS. You can just Google it, or it's at volts.wtf, believe it or not.
WTF. Very, very good.
Hopefully that's memorable.
Yeah. So, maybe I just kind of ask maybe to pose the same question to you, or have you continue that in terms of, this moment that we're at right now, and looking at whether there's reason for optimism or skepticism in the immediate road ahead.
Sure. I think as a kind of clean energy and climate reporter, how optimistic you feel depends on sort of what area you're mostly focused on. Certainly relative to 10 or even 5 years ago, business is very far along. Technology is much farther along than we thought. The finances are in place. Financial instruments are starting to fall into place. A lot of pieces are starting to fall into place. We're sort of poised and ready, but one of my main areas of focus is government, the federal government, and I have always believed and still believe that we're not going to get where we need to go without the federal government playing a coordinating and accelerating role in all this. And I don't see the federal government stepping into anything like that role, and I don't anticipate things getting better at the federal level anytime soon. I mean, I think we sort of a narrowly averted disaster, but we're still kind of stumbling along at the precipice of, constitutional crisis all the time. So it's frustrating. Everything's there, ready, except for the federal government, is how I would summarize it.
Wait, David, you don't think things are going to get better at all?
Well, like in the world, period. I mean, I'll just say in terms of federal politics, to me, what looks like the default course over the next 3 or 4 years is that Republicans take the Senate, Republicans take Congress in 2022, and probably the White House in 2024. And, and then, they've made it very clear that they no longer accept the outcomes of elections they lose. So I just think we're really like stumbling around some serious issues here in terms of a crisis of legitimacy for our government, a crisis of democracy. And at that, Biden can get the federal agencies working, moving in the right direction, and I'm sure he will. But as we saw, Obama did that too, and Trump was able to just reverse or kill a lot of it, most of it. So this flopping back and forth between two kind of diametrically opposed outlooks and philosophies and directions is just not a recipe for stability, regulatory stability, financial stability. And that's what I think entrepreneurs and businesses want and need is a direction and some predictability and stability. And right now, the federal government is not providing that. Yeah,
that is, I guess, something to look towards, and brings up the question of whether or not there need, as there is already, but this kind of synergy between policymaking, innovation, and other factors that can help to sort of complement, this evolution into the grid, and prevent there being only one sort of factor driving things. If there's enough of a compelling case that can be made, sort of on the business side, which we've seen, sort of throughout the clean tech space, make the strong business argument and hope that policymaking can come around to it. So I guess it's to be determined. But before we get too deep into that, I want to make sure that I get to introduce Katie as well. And thank you, Katie, for being with us too. Katie, currently at GreenBiz, a senior writer, really leading all of the publication's coverage around electric mobility, which of course is one of the huge aspects around, the future of the grid is how are we going to prepare for the future of electric mobility, and is it in fact a two-way street where both can sort of positively affect one another and lead to more infrastructure, better both grid-based infrastructure and charging infrastructure, and the kinds of technologies that are involved there. But previous to that, Katie was at Fortune and at GigaOhm as well, and 15 plus years has just been like on the beat constantly, and it's great to have you here too. And you also have your own newsletter too. It's transportation.
It's called Transport Weekly.
Transport Weekly.
Yeah, specifically, you can go on greenbiz.com, go to our newsletter section, and it should show up there. Can you hear me okay? A little bit of an echo.
I can hear you fine. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So, yes, that comes out Tuesday morning. Thank you so much for having me, Tim. Love being on a session with David's. Big fans of both their work. So I'm covering, exclusively the transformation of transportation, and a lot of it is around electrification of vehicles. And so to answer your overarching question, I think it is a super exciting time right now for electric vehicles. I think that finally a lot of the automakers are getting on board. I think the Biden administration is going to be a huge opportunity for a lot of the companies to both in the green stimulus, but also just, reversing the auto emission standards, the weakening of the auto emission standards, and kind of, potentially the EPA administrator, whoever that be, maybe it's even Mary Nichols. I think that it's just a really interesting time right now, specifically for the electrification of vehicles. When it comes to electric vehicles and grid integration, I think that's still at an early phase, and there's going to be a lot that needs to happen over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years for the opportunity of EVs to really be a benefit to utilities and power companies and consumers in that kind of grid integrated way.
That's interesting. And what do you think like some of those drivers might be? Because I would think that with the just incredible boom in EVs and how we're seeing, like California begin to, sort of set expectations and standards for auto sales and really moving to full electric, fleets within the state, that those are going to be forcing factors that are going to compel utilities to make, the kinds of improvements that we're talking about. But I just wonder whether you all feel like that's the case, or it's I think historically utilities are somewhat conservative in how they move, and there's not a lot of desire to take risks when you're a utility. So will it be compelling enough case to begin to institute much needed changes on their side, or will it continue to be an effort of trying to bait them into taking steps forward and confronting this idea of, well, let's just kind of play it safe and not make any big changes?
I think it's hard.
I've got a question about that.
Katie, you want to go on?
I would like to toss to Katie. Can I ask Katie a question?
Yeah.
It's my sense is that a lot of utilities are facing something like a death spiral as more and more power moves to the customer side of things, as demand is not really rising, as sort of the legacy costs are catching up with them. A lot of utilities are in a really tight squeeze, and one of the things that would really help them is a giant source of new load, a giant source of new demand, and that to me is what EVs represent. So from a utilities perspective, just going gangbusters on EVs, promoting them in every way possible, seems like just a win-win-win for them. They can possibly rate base electricity charging infrastructure. They'll have new load. They'll even have some controllable load, which will help them with stability and control. So, and yet I don't see the nation's utilities rising up and demanding EVs. So I'm sort of wondering, what is the dynamic there? Why aren't they as bullish on EVs as it seems to me they ought to be?
I mean, I think it's the same answer why we're hesitant to adopt, a lot of these distributed solar resources and energy storage at first, that they are just slow moving entities, partially regulated or fully regulated, and are slow to adopt technology. I think that's an interesting comment from Joseph on the chat, create more NextEra type companies. I mean, I totally agree. Companies that are, NextEra Energy Resources just acquired a startup that's doing fleet electrification. There's a lot of, companies that are structured in other ways that are just following kind of the business case, and the best business case, is emerging. A lot of them are around, electrification of vehicles. So, I mean, I don't think I have a great answer for you, but it's the same hesitancy that is, slowed down distributed solar and energy storage at the beginning. I think we need just kind of good business cases for them to realize. And I think some of those business cases will be in the commercial space. So like electric school buses, for example, can provide a really interesting opportunity for school districts to work with utilities and to aggregate the load that electric buses can provide to the grid when they're not being used. So they're not really used a lot of the day, just like in the morning in the pickup, and they're not used in the summer. So things like that, like a commercial business case that can actually show that there is a lot of grid capacity and they can use this as a flexible load, I think will be important going forward.
I want to add something there too, in that I think utilities, yes, are traditionally very much a conservative, slow-moving industry, and that is somewhat by design. They are not supposed to go out and do risky things, or at least they weren't originally set up that way. They were supposed to be the boring company you always depended upon. However, they have, within the last few years, I feel, really come around on the energy transition in general. And they've come around because they like the idea of making a profit off of installing big infrastructure. And they've come to realize that this transition will require a lot of new infrastructure that they can then base, or hopefully rate base. When they're looking at electric vehicles, I don't think that's probably as appealing an investment right now, today, to some companies in utilities, say in the middle of the country where EV sales are still pretty small. I think it'll become a more interesting, a more appealing investment to them over time. But for those folks right now, if I were in their shoes, I'd be much more interested in talking to my regulators about getting permission to rate base a wind farm, something like that, a solar plant, or a transmission line connected to one of those. That to me would seem like a much better use of my time and my capital than an EV project today. But talk to me in another 5 years, I might feel differently.
They're not doing transmission either, though.
They would like to. Oh, Tim, I think you're muted.
Yeah, Tim, you're muted.
Very good. I was.
There we go.
But what I started to say was that it makes me think about, the role of tech innovation in order to help, compel this kind of change, which certainly is true in the case of EVs. But we've also seen, I think, pros and cons of where innovators have either gotten on board on, we've seen such broad adoption of solar and wind right now, and as the costs have dipped down, I know that has made an impact in the accumulation of distributed energy. It reminds me of the case of Bloom, which was, I think, just called out a couple of days ago in the Wall Street Journal as kind of a retrospective look back at the enthusiasm of that company's energy storage technology when it first came out. But it kind of came prematurely to the evolution in solar and wind, whereas now the article pointed out that the cost of solar and wind is so cheap that it's really made technologies like the Bloom box less attractive. It's more expensive to store energy that way than to just be able to use renewable energy. So in a way, like I can see, that, or in the case of EVs or others, where there's, clearly tech drivers helping inform things, but it's a much bigger, universe that's being dealt with, and whether or not a particular technology has the ability to really disrupt within the utility space is to some extent dependent on this sort of holistic system that we're in. It's not any one technology, but it's how everything plays together. But I'd be curious to get your, if that resonates with you, you feel like there might be examples to support that idea or not.
To me, the lesson of those two, to me, the lesson of the Bloom box is also the lesson of Solyndra, and also the lesson of a bunch of other alternative battery companies, which is that it just turned out to be a really bad idea to bet against solar panels and lithium-ion batteries because they just got super cheap, super fast, and it's the storage. This is this gets back to the question of utilities being slow moving and sort of institutionally conservative. They're in a sticky place right now because they're sort of forced right now to be making lots of big bets, but it's genuinely uncertain which are the big bets to make. And one of those areas of uncertainty to me is storage. It's sort of conventional wisdom at this point that storage is going to be kind of the limiting factor on solar and wind, and we can't get high penetrations of solar and wind until we have a ton of storage on the grid. And we need seasonal storage and all this kind of things. But the way things are going, to me, if you just project ahead, the way things have been going to the future is renewable energy is getting so cheap so fast that I almost think it's going to make more sense to just overbuild in most places than it is to install a lot of storage, just to overdo renewable energy. So a lot of it's sitting idle a lot of the time. It's so cheap that it's almost I think going to be easy to do that. And so maybe then we'll need less storage than we thought. And we really don't know. I mean, it's not, I would not envy utilities in a lot of these decisions they're having to make right now.
Interesting. Katie, do you guys have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it would be difficult to get to that overbuilt state very quickly, though, because even renewable power projects that have backing from Republicans and Democrats alike, that people say, okay, this is good, cheap power, let's add it. When you actually get down to the point of building a specific project on a specific site and getting the permits and appeasing the neighbors, it's often a lot harder to get built than it would seem in the abstract. And I can point you to any number of sites around the country where there was a wind project or a solar project planned, didn't go through because either the state regulators balked or more likely the neighbors raised hell about it. So building out that way, I'm not sure how long that would take. And it still wouldn't get you past the problems of needing power on really dark days where you got a lot of clouds for maybe weeks on end. Nighttime where, California, we've got some wind at night, but it's not nearly enough to make up for what we lose in solar production. So I think we do still need those big long range storage things, and those remain a limiting factor in this, in my opinion.
Yeah, and also, the price of lithium-ion batteries is still coming down significantly, and over the next 5 years will be just even dramatically cheaper than they are today, even though they're not necessarily providing that perfect application for renewable energy storage.
Interesting. Well, we haven't specifically brought up yet the change in the administration that's taking place, we assume, and where 2021 and beyond is going to take us. Biden has his green grid by 2035 plan. I want to make sure that we can touch on that as well. I think that there's a growing sense that things may change in some ways that can help innovation around the grid through the coming administration. We've heard about some of that even just earlier today through the show. But I know that there are a lot of questions as well about that. And to the extent that you followed that so far, I'm wondering if you guys have any feedback about what's been talked about so far. Whether the plan is kind of realistic in your eyes, or whether there might be some potential roadblocks in place that are going to have to get ironed out before we can really look forward to adopting a kind of a federal policy around the grid, when of course it's fractured into so many different, is it a federal issue? Is it a regional or state issue? That becomes complex too. So, thoughts on that, anyone?
I think with, when you talk to people in different parts of the sphere, there are people here in the Bay Area, like Energy Innovation, the think tank here in the San Francisco, where they've done some modeling on 2035, and they say you can get 90% of the way there in terms of decarbonization and actually save money. You'll still end up spending more to get that last 10% out, but they think it's actually fairly doable. I've posed the same question, however, to a couple of executives at different utility companies, including a couple of CEOs, and their take is we're in line with that goal. We like the goal. That year is not realistic, and we're going to try to talk Biden into maybe 10-year delay. They're a bit more comfortable. But even then, you're talking about schedule. You're not talking about the end goal itself. They're actually okay with that end goal. They just want more time.
Dave,
I mean, I think it's absolutely technologically achievable. I think that's been established to a fairly well at this point, and even affordable. The question again comes back to the federal government's coordinating role, and Biden is not going to have Congress. He's, the Republicans will control the Senate, and they're not going to pass a big climate or clean energy bill. So we have to kind of narrow our perspective to what is possible on this grid goal through the tools of administrative action, through federal agencies. What can EPA do? What can Department of Energy do? Even Department of Agriculture. There's a lot that can be done through the mechanisms of the federal agencies, but not the kind of comprehensive legislation that would be required to get to zero on the grid by 2035. I mean, I don't think, unless Congress can somehow be brought around to agreeing to some sort of big, bold plan, I think that goal is going to remain out of reach.
I know you bristle at the phrase political will, but in effect, is it essentially, the political will that is ultimately going to be the driver here?
Yeah, I do bristle at that term. I feel like it's a term that people here in the energy world just sort of stick on a giant nest of very difficult problems. That's sort of like a shortcut to not having to understand them. But I mean, the problem is that the Republican Party is institutionally aligned with fossil fuels, institutionally opposed to this progress, and institutionally has a lock on the Senate due to sort of the distorting features of the American system of government. I mean, I'm not going to recite the whole list again. I'm sure everybody's familiar at this point. The Electoral College, the money in politics, the overrepresentation of rural areas in the Senate, all these things basically put the fossil fuel party, give it disproportionate power to block things, and that's the problem. Plenty of people in the Democratic Party have the will. The public has the will. If you look at surveys, public surveys, the public wants it. I mean, solar and wind power have pulled through the roof for as long as I've been doing this, including among Republicans. If you ask Republicans on surveys, they want rapid progress on clean energy. It's just the party elite is against it, and the party elite is extremely entrenched. So just like putting the label political will on all of that, it doesn't elucidate much. The question is like how to give the public's overwhelming preferences in this area a voice in actual policy.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, and that kind of harkens back in a way, sort of, DR, you're talking about, on the political side, the fact that there is likely what you feel is a true will to make change, but it has to go through the political process, which is convoluted, frustrating. It's extremely polarized right now, and that sort of in the short term is a hindrance to this. And then DB, you had also mentioned about sort of on the utility side that utilities are willing to go down this road, although they are conservative moving, and it's like, you know, we want to, ultimately they want to get there, but they want to have a voice in that process and not have, you know, it completely be taken away from them through regulations and such. So it's kind of interesting to see that both sides, who clearly need to work together, have sort of these, you know, individual drivers and concerns that might, in a sense, sort of keep them apart from one another. That road to bring them together is going to be hard to walk over time. It may take a while to get there. And I don't know if that captures, you know, kind of your thinking as well, but seems like that's the case.
I put it this way: we're so used to in this country dealing with energy issues on a state-by-state basis, and that actually makes a lot of sense in a lot of ways, even when you're talking about the energy transition, because I think all the, you know, the renewable opportunities that we have in California, well, they're not the same here as they are in Iowa. They're not the same as they are in Georgia. So it makes some sense that we would still continue hashing out the particulars that way. But I think DR is absolutely right. For what we need to do, there is interest and will on the corporate end of things to get this done, but we do definitely need a concerted push from the federal level to really make it work and come together on a decent timetable. And yeah, that will probably mean that we need to move faster than some people are comfortable with, and might actually end up with some stranded costs along the way as we invest in things that later turn out, oh, maybe we could have done it with something cheaper, a different technology cheaper. That is the kind of risk that each utility is going to be facing, and their regulators are going to be facing over and over again over the next, I think, 20 years, trying to decide, okay, is this the right project? Is this the right pathway here? Or could we actually do better by our ratepayers someplace else? Because they are very keenly aware that they can't just, you know, pile cost upon cost on their customers. So I'm glad that it does get hashed out at the state level in that sense, because you really do need people a little closer to the ground than the federal government to look out for the conditions of each particular state and the realities of each state. But I'm totally in agreement with DR that we need a strong federal push over years to really coordinate everything and make sure that we as a nation are moving forward. And it is hard to see how we get from this particular moment in our history to that kind of agreement and years-long push. Because yes, it does mean that both parties at some point have to sign on to the basics of this plan.
Yeah, and there's, you know, we talk about political will, but there's also public will too. And in, you know, Katie, I think that electric mobility and certainly, you know, the rise of electric vehicles has created so much enthusiasm around just the public at large. And granted, I think it is kind of a regional thing that's ultimately sort of sweeping towards the center of the country. But we've seen, you know, incredible amount of enthusiasm for EVs. And I would argue we've talked earlier today about sort of the electrification of everything, which might be a way that things are going. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about the impact that just, you know, public enthusiasm and demand for the infrastructure to help support the gadgets that we all love so much, whether it's, you know, our laptops, our phones, or our vehicles, which are going to demand more and more of this. Like, if you feel as though that is a big driver as well and a consideration when it comes to, you know, helping to spur innovation.
I mean, I think electric vehicles are a really interesting item in that, you know, they can engage people more directly in the grid and electrification in general. I mean, Tesla has kind of famously done that by making the electric car sexy, and then, you know, making a solar roof sexy, and making just a bunch of batteries in a box sexy. And, you know, like when we talk about utilities and their reactions to EVs, you know, one of the things that they do say is that they do see EVs as an opportunity for like further engagement with their customers. So, you know, it's a way to have their customer be very engaged in a product. Whereas, you know, over the years, a lot of people try to push like the energy management system in people's homes, and like the Nest, you know, had some success on that level. But, you know, an electric vehicle is kind of, you know, leaps and bounds above in terms of, you know, representing someone's personality and, you know, having a very emotional attachment to a person. So, I mean, I think that's a real opportunity for utilities to engage their customers in a new way. And I think EVs also, when you're talking about, you mentioned a path for innovation. I mean, I think EVs are the reason that, you know, one of the major reasons that lithium ion batteries have dropped in cost so significantly, because they're building these huge factories to produce lithium ion batteries for EVs. And so it's the e-mobility transportation space that is helping reduce the cost of lithium ion batteries, which will help stationary storage and help other industries as well. So I think, you know, EVs have a real opportunity to be a power of innovation in addition to that kind of engagement touch point.
That's excellent. It kind of makes me think of the opposite as well, like just, you know, in addition to the sort of the craving technology, what that's going to take and whether or not that's a driver. We also have, and I think, you know, we need to address the shortcomings in the utility space, particularly when it comes to, you know, risk around transmission, the wildfire issue that, you know, we felt so hard over the last few years. And, you know, and whether or not you feel like that also might be a driver for change that could not only address sort of safety issues in transmission, but also as just an opportunity to renew the grid as those improvements come about. I mean, you know, these public safety power shutoffs and whatever. I mean, like, I think we're technically still in fire season here in California. We have yet to get a good rain, and just kind of apprehensive of, you know, what's going to happen. I think everyone in the West is like that, and certainly people in the East in the path of hurricanes have to deal with, you know, the incredible state that the grid is in right now, and how precarious it is, and, you know, it just doesn't take much to bring it all down. What about that as being a factor for driving change? I mean, I know you've all looked at that. DB in particular, you've done a lot of reporting around, you know, the wildfires and PG&E's, you know, situation where they're at, and others. Do you think like that's also a driver, and might that also be a way to, you know, include grid improvements?
It's definitely a driver. It's not one that people are particularly happy about. You know, we are having to harden the grid because it is fragile in all kinds of ways that we keep discovering. And yes, it's particularly acute in California. I think everybody would love to be spending that money on something else. You know, I think the utilities would rather be spending that money on other things. But it will lead to more of the sort of decentralized vision of the grid that we were thinking of anyway, just because of distributed generation. I think it's another of the drivers pushing away from the old centralized model to a grid that it has a lot more sources coming onto it and can be islanded very quickly as needed. It definitely is going to drive a ton of investment over the coming years. And also, you know, it's going to have a lot of effect at the consumer level as well. The wildfires that we had tied to last year, Generac, the purveyor of diesel generators, they did great. Their sales went through the roof here, and they immediately bought a battery company to get into that space too. And now they're happy to sell you either one, whichever you prefer. And I find it hilarious that here in California, you know, Tesla still doesn't advertise its cars on TV, but pretty much every night I see a solar plus battery ad from some installer or another that will make sure to show a Tesla Powerwall somewhere in the camera shot. So it's driving consumer demand towards that different grid as well. we all wish that that particular reason weren't there. I mean, we're doing it to avoid killing people, essentially. But it's going to be a lot of money.
Could I add a
Say what?
note on that? Could I add a note on that
Please do, yeah.
before we wrap up? This is a old axe of mine to grind, so I can't let it pass. I think that I think DB is absolutely right that the obvious lesson of the fires and the fragile transmission grid is that we ought to be moving toward a more distributed energy system with more control and more generation happening at the local level on distribution grids, and more sort of less solving problems with giant bulk power and more efficiency and intelligent energy use and all these kind of things. The transition to that would be happening right now in California much faster, but for the basic regulatory structure in which utilities are operating. An investor-owned utility makes its money by buying big stuff, by investing in infrastructure. It wants to build new things so that it can get a rate of return on them. It doesn't make its rate of return on maintaining those big things once it's built them. So that's one reason it's also junky now. And it doesn't make money off infrastructure if the customer builds and owns it on the customer side of the meter. So the sort of regulatory structure in which investor-owned utilities are operating today inherently biases them against distribution, against distributed energy, against sort of moving down to the local level and relying more on microgrids and all these kind of things. If we could figure out, and this is a Gordian knot, but if we could figure out how to repair or revise or reform the basic utility regulatory structure in which they operate so that they make money by providing services rather than by building stuff, I think this transition would be happening much, much, much faster. Like all the economics and the need and all the arrows are pointing in that direction. It's the utility structure itself that is providing such a break on this process. So I mean, that's kind of in the background of all these decisions, and something that I think we should really keep in mind is that as long as utilities want to build big centralized giant infrastructure, they're not going to want to do the kind of things that would really in practice make our grid safer and cleaner.
Well, that's that realistic perspective that I think we wanted to get at the panel. I thank you guys so much for joining me on this and sharing your thoughts about where we're headed. It's been informative to me, and I'm sure it is for everyone that's been tuning in. Any final thoughts from either of you? Hey, Richie, I see you joining there too. We're just about to wrap, but yeah, thanks. Katie, DB, any parting thoughts before we close?
No, I mean, I think kind of what I said at the beginning, I think is just a kind of a little bit more optimistic note, especially for electric vehicles. I think 2021 is going to be one of the most exciting times in the US to date around electric vehicles, as well as David Baker briefly talked about kind of the emergence of a new clean tech. People call it like climate tech these days. I think that's also a really exciting opportunity that, we haven't seen yet before. So I'm excited about the future.
Just by way of concluding, I would say sign up for my newsletter. And Katie.
Absolutely. Thanks for jumping in with the plug. I do want to make sure everyone does that. Volts.wtf and Transportation Weekly at GreenBiz.
Yeah,
and of course, Bloomberg. Everywhere Bloomberg is David Baker. Thank you guys all so much. I really appreciate you jumping in on this, and wish you well. And thank you, Richie, for the opportunity to be able to do this and participate in the event. And congratulations on bringing it all together virtually this year. I know it's 2020 has been the year for everybody, kind of a one for the books, one I'm very excited to be done with. But I congratulate you and the whole team for being able to put together this event and and making the virtual model work so well.
Well, thank you. I appreciate everybody leaning in on it, right? We need to connect. We need to share these messages. This isn't easy. there's a bunch of different languages that we're kind of all learning online. So I appreciate this panel here or joining us as well. I'm glad we kind of turned it all full circle here in this conversation, where it certainly started, really at utilities, and then, it's David just bringing back, the construct that some utilities are in is it, where's the real challenge? And I think I'm looking forward to interacting more with you guys, virtually over the next year, and hopefully we can do more of these kind of panels. So thank you all, and we'll just wrap up here. You guys are wrapping up the whole thing with me right now. And it's been a great 3 days. And David, I'll make sure that I get in your plug for the new newsletter. We've got a lot of plugs over the last 3 days that we're going to be sharing in a recap. Everything's been recorded, and we will be clipping and cleaning those up and getting these out as well. So, this conversation continues, and I appreciate the audience and the people that were able to communicate with us and the interaction that I was able to see. So, again, a great week. Thank you for closing it down, guys. And we'll see everybody online for now. But we can do it in person.
Cheers. Thank you. Be healthy, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, guys.